From Korea to Germany. From Alaska to Puerto Rico. All over the world, the men and women of your Army are on the alert to defend our nation, you, the American people, against aggression. This is the big picture.
Welcome to the Big Picture, presented by your United States Army. I'm Captain Carl Zimmerman. Today we spotlight the reserve team, the men of the Organized Reserve, the National Guard, and the R.O.T.C. Citizen soldiers keeping themselves trained and ready to become part of the Army of the United States should it become necessary. Here indeed is a vital part of the big picture, the reserve team.
Today, the American people live in times of uneasy peace. If an aggressor should strike, there may not be time for us to get ready and prepare. In one blinding atomic flash, America's strength can be challenged, and only the state of its preparedness will determine its survival. This survival depends on the Army, and the Army today in high gear, with manpower pouring into its ranks every month, is at attention and on guard. And ready, too, is the Army Reserve Team. Civilians just doing their jobs. Civilians who are also trained and combat-ready soldiers without the uniform. They are the men who make up the National Guard, the Organized Reserve Corps, and the R.O.T.C. This is the Reserve Team, a people's army which keeps itself trained and ready for defense in times of peace. They are part-time soldiers who once a week put on a uniform and organize for defense. Civilian soldiers carrying on a tradition begun in 1776. The volunteer militia, they called it then, but it was the beginning of the National Guard. To teach his recruits, General Washington turned to the only men with military training, the volunteer militia. In 1812, the volunteer militia was again called upon to defend their country in war. Then came the Civil War, and the state militia regiments furnished many of the officers and drill sergeants for the armies of the North and South. Today, the battered battle flags of their regiments bear mute evidence of their sacrifice and bravery. War with Spain and the fighting in the Philippines found the organized militia in battle for the first time in large numbers outside the United States. And out of this experience was to come widespread Army reforms, including the Dick Bill, which was signed by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1903. The antiquated militia laws were wiped off the books, and the organized militia, now coming to be called the National Guard, became an important factor in our national defense structure. For the first time, its members received federal arms and equipment for their peacetime training, and for the first time, they received pay. As armories were built in many cities, the ranks of the National Guard grew, and the supply of equipment grew with them. By 1917, and with the outbreak of World War I, the National Guard had come of age and was ready. Then, as it can now, this reserve team went into action and with the regular Army divisions, met and turned back the German tide. 2/5 of the AEF divisions were National Guardsmen. These divisions spent more days in combat than all other units combined. And when it was over and all America turned its back on the military things, the National Guard continued to train. For them, peace did not mean relaxation. Peace was to stay prepared. The Guard practiced the games of war, learning lessons which would save lives on the battlefield. It got the last ounce of use out of every piece of equipment, practicing against the day when pontoon bridges would be constructed under fire, and river crossings in assault boats would be the real thing. That day soon came. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. It was no longer a game, but long before this day of infamy, the National Guard had been mobilized and was on maneuvers in Louisiana. And while regular Army and National Guard units were slugging it out with the Japs, more Guard units were undergoing basic training back home. The record of the National Guard divisions in World War II is history, a proud record worthy of the best traditions of the volunteer militia. Along with regular Army divisions, they bore the brunt of the early fighting while our Army was being built up. They were in the thick of the fighting in North Africa, Italy, and France. They fought valiantly during the Battle of the Bulge and were among the leaders in the sweep across Germany. In the Pacific, they played a key role against the Japs and took part in the advance of General MacArthur's armies. To meet any aggressor, the Army of the United States has brought itself to full combat readiness and is trained for instant action. The regular Army provides a permanent overhead for the entire Army of the United States, and around this skeleton organization are expanded Army forms in an emergency. The National Guard plays a dual role, that of being both a state and federal force. In time of national emergency, it is an organized force immediately available to the federal government for action. In the event of internal disaster, the National Guard is a local protective force available to state and territorial governors to supplement local enforcement of law and order. At the same time, it assists in emergency relief for local disaster victims. The training that a National Guardsman gets is thorough, whether he's in the infantry, artillery, anti-aircraft, armor, or any of the many specialized skills for which training in the National Guard is offered. The National Guardsman can turn his enlistment to good use for the future by learning a trade as a blacksmith, for instance, or a radio technician, or in any number of trades for which training is offered by the National Guard. Thousands of these part-time soldiers in the National Guard are trained and ready as part of America's reserve team. Drill builds them up physically and produces self-respect and confidence. And class periods teach them military theory and tactics. They learn how to live in the field at summer camp, and they get paid for learning. For every 2-hour training period, each guardsman draws a full day's pay. The tradition of the volunteer militia remains strong as ever. They are citizens on guard, citizens who are trained and ready when the call comes. They are soldiers now, like this National Guard unit, the 43rd Division, passing in review before being sent overseas. Yesterday, they were civilians working at peace. Today, mobilized and on the move, they are the Army, working to keep peace. They are saluted for their service. Now they go out in defense, leaving behind them the very things for which they fight. "24 hours later, the worst goodbyes are over, and they're still marching. They are pointed overseas, to Japan, Korea, Europe. Somewhere they are needed, and they are on their way. At the embarkation center, the men unload. One by one, the National Guardsmen are checked in before boarding the troop ship. Troop movements take a lot of organization and paperwork, and sending a division overseas is a complicated procedure. The troops carry full field equipment with them, but a hot cup of coffee and a donut from the Red Cross help to brighten the embarkation. At last, it's time to go. Everything has been double-checked and all the troops are on board. The lines are cast off. And a tugboat noses the big ship out into the sea. They arrive overseas and a new life begins. It's a rugged field life with simulated combat conditions. They take part in field exercises under all kinds of conditions, maneuvers, putting classroom theory into practice, furthering their readiness for combat. Yesterday, they were salesmen and office workers. Today, they are combat-ready troops, standing guard in a foreign land. As in every crisis in our country's history, the National Guardsman has rallied to his country's need. Since the Korean campaign began, more than 1,600 National Guard units have been committed. More than 120,000 Army Guardsmen are on active military duty in all parts of the world, in combat and in Europe with the forces of NATO. As well as men, the National Guard has furnished $193 million worth of badly needed material and equipment to the Army, over and above that taken into active service by the Army Guard units. Meanwhile, all over the country, other National Guardsmen are staying fit and are learning to handle the weapons of war. When needed, they are ready. From out of the ranks in civilian life comes another part of the reserve team, the civilian soldiers who belong to the Organized Reserve Corps. Civil servants, businessmen, and office workers, men in all walks of life. These are the reserves. Many of them former members of the armed forces back at their peacetime jobs, but still organized as a fighting force ready to defend their beliefs. At least once a week, they meet as soldiers. Not fair weather soldiers, these, but double-duty Americans, mobilizing to preserve our national security. They're in the Army once a week, saturating themselves in the reservoir of military knowledge which makes a good soldier. They must stay familiar with a .50 caliber machine gun. Listen to lectures on ordnance and learn about new sights, safety switches, and a new selector. Developments and improvements in weapons goes on, and the reserves keep up to date. At summer camp, they get a chance to apply what they've learned. They get field training in weapons, training in combat intelligence, training in military sanitation, communications, first aid, training, and more training. A reserve army prepared for the future. In an emergency, the Reserve Corps has its skilled men ready to fight in the infantry, ready to get things moving and keep them moving. Specialists ready with hospital units, laundry units, and the men to keep the Army fighting on its stomach. There are women in the reserve, too, like Sergeant Shirley Novak, a housewife, but she's a skirted soldier, too. A soldier dietitian, trained and experienced in keeping fighting men fed and fit. It's everybody's Army these days, from the cab driver in the city to the man on the farm. It's being ready that counts, and the reservists are ready. And they were ready when the Korean conflict broke out. The first units of the civilian components in action in Korea were organized reserves. More than 200,000 members of the organized reserve have been called to active duty since Korea, as individuals and in 969 company-size units. Yes, the reserve is ready to serve, backed by the strength of the nation. Of great importance to America's national defense is the third member of our reserve team, the R.O.T.C, Reserve Officers Training Corps. For here in its youth, America has a vast reserve of potential military leaders. Across the campuses of colleges and high schools, every year, walk thousands of students who make military training a part of their college career. Along with their academic studies, they train for 3 hours a week to become Army officers. They wear their uniform with pride. Only one of the 3 hours is spent on the drill field. The rest of the time, they learn about military science and tactics, such as map reading and the evolution of warfare. The R.O.T.C student must know his weapons, and he starts with the M1 rifle. He must know how to disassemble it in the dark and how it works. On the firing range, everyone learns to squeeze the trigger. Supervised shooting trains the eye and steadies the nerves. In the second year as NCOs, students drill the class of new freshmen, building self-confidence and getting used to issuing orders. Training in 16 arms and services is offered, and students are channeled into the branch of Army compatible with their college course. Men preparing for civilian engineering careers are attached to the engineer branch of R.O.T.C. And those in the Quartermaster Corps learn about merchandising and other fields where distribution is important. In their efforts to master the vast amount of military and mechanical knowledge which they must know, these students use training aids like this. A special revolving chassis enables them to see all the parts at the same time. And students in the veterinary corps use a live model to learn about horses. The training in arms increases, and students get used to handling bigger weapons, artillery pieces, or the recoilless rifle. If they continue the third year of training, R.O.T.C. students begin a course which will lead to a commission in the Organized Reserve Corps or the regular Army. The future they can play in their country's destiny is brought home to them, and those selected begin the long, hard course of advanced study. The students train for their final proficiency tests, which take place at an R.O.T.C. summer camp. From different states and colleges, the upperclassmen soldiers pour into the summer camps maintained by the various Army branches. For the next 6 weeks, they are in the Army, and they get an Army going over inside and out. Schoolroom soldiering is over. Now it's bivouac in the field.